In an Oval Office meeting this past March, the New York Times reports that President Trump offered up an astonishing solution to the crisis at the southern border between the United States and Mexico, sending his advisors into a complete state of panic. The Times reports the president's vision involved completely shutting down the 2,000-mile border by noon the next day, potentially trapping American tourists in Mexico, stranding school children on either side of the border, and prompting an economic crisis for both nations. But this is not the first time the president presented his own style to solve the border crisis. The Times based their article on interviews with more than a dozen White House and administration officials and says President Trump privately advocated for adding a water-filled trench to the border, which would then be filled with snakes and alligators. It is a suggestion the White House aides then sought an actual cost estimate for. He also wanted the wall electrified, and he wanted it to have spikes on top that could pierce human flesh. And if all of those methods failed, the president suggested that soldiers shoot migrants in the legs to slow them down. President Trump has denied these claims on Twitter earlier today. These suggestions came in addition to several proposals the Trump administration was discussing at the time to try and curb migration at the border. NBC has reported the plans included reinstating the family separations, busing immigrants to sanctuary cities, and using border agents to conduct asylum interviews. That one actually went through. I want to note one thing. If you remember, Allie, that interview that Ivanka Trump did at the end of last summer with ABC News when she referenced the child separation policy being a low point in the administration, I wonder where Ivanka Trump, first daughter, senior advisor to President Trump, feels now since it's been brought up again.
Well, among the people in the room for that meeting was now acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan, according to the New York Times. He was the Customs and Border Protection chief at the time. And in a new interview with the Washington Post, McAleenan expressed, among other things, his frustration that his own department is being used for a partisan immigration agenda. McAleenan, who says he maintains operational control of the DHS, told Washington Post, quote, "What I don't have control over is the tone, the message, the public face, and approach of the department in an increasingly polarized time. That's uncomfortable," as the accountable senior figure. Joining us now is the Washington Post reporter and author of that piece, Nick Miroff.
I'm going to go first. If he's concerned that his department is being used for a partisan agenda, he can only be talking about one party, and that would be the Republican Party and President Trump, who appointed him to that job.
That's right. Well, you got to remember McAleenan is a career official who was at U.S. Customs and Border Protection for many years before this, and he very much wants to try to maintain the image and the public face of DHS and immigration enforcement more broadly as a neutral law enforcement body, and that is very much at odds with the way with the kind of moment we're in particular, in the way that the White House and the Trump administration want to promote their immigration agenda.
I'm a little surprised after the New York Times story yesterday and the Washington Post story that you've written that McAleenan is speaking as freely about this, because the sense is that anyone who wants to not be partisan and who runs a department in this administration is soon gone.
Yeah, I think he's in an increasingly tenuous position. I mean, he's been at the top of DHS now for nearly 6 months, longer than any other DHS leader has been in an acting capacity. There's no sign that he's going to be nominated for the permanent position, and he's been increasingly isolated in this administration and is one of the last remaining figures who tries to kind of talk about and message these things from a kind of more neutral career law enforcement official perspective, and that's left him, I think, more and more isolated, and that was reflected in his statements.
Immigration at the border has been largely out of the headlines, at least in the last few weeks. Why is it that McAleenan, do you believe, would be speaking so freely now, especially given that he's only got the acting title, not permanent?
Well, I mean, ironically, he's done the one thing that mattered most to the president. I mean, you went through some of the more extreme, all these extreme proposals that came out of these meetings with President Trump in the White House that expressed, the degree of frustration he had with the situation at the border. We can remember that, back in May, there was at the peak, there were 144,000 people being taken into custody in a single month. And McAleenan over the last 6 months has really changed that dynamic. He's driven those numbers down through some very controversial measures. But those levels of those border numbers have fallen by nearly 2/3. And so this thing that had driven the president, to a really desperate place is now finally, become this kind of bright spot that he's pointing to, and he believes he can once more run on in his reelection plan. So, McAleenan is standing on that record.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.